Hello, BookTube. Some of you may have noticed, and I will leave a link for those of you who have not, that Barb over at the Font and her unseen partner in crime, Isabella, has been doing a series of videos. It's just started on bookish issues, bookish battles or struggles of one kind or another. And the latest one is on book snobbery. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. I have been raging against not only book snobbery, but snobbery just in general of all kinds for a long, long time, even while I have been engaged in a rearguard action of trying to deal with my own snobbery, which is, I think, the way for a lot of us. The key is the struggle, as always. Not to get too Marxian on you, but in their video, they talked about various aspects of the personal feeling of being the victim of snobbery. The word insecurity comes up a lot in their video, which is tremendous reading. It's tremendously, as was the predecessor, it's tremendously honest, just discussion about these things that affect all readers to one extent or another. I strongly recommend it. But I couldn't let the subject go by without putting in my 2 cents worth now, could I? Especially since snobbery and I go way back. Insecurity and I do not. I know that's going to put me in a bit of a minority amongst the mewling introverts of BookTube, but nevertheless, it's true. I don't have much to say on the subject of how it eats away at you to feel like someone's laughing at you. Not at all. But I do have a lot to say on the subject of snobbery. So I thought I'd make a little video on that as a sort of companion to their video. And the first thing I think I want to do is define what we're talking about, define what snobbery is. We can talk about it in context of books, but really it applies just across the board. And for the purposes of this discussion, we can describe snobbery as an uncritical dismissal of a category. And we'll put emphasis on both those terms, on uncritical and category. So with that description, it's not possible for you to be snobbish towards one particular book. It needs to be a category, a categorical dismissal. And likewise, uncritical is important because you're not, my definition of snobbery doesn't make it impossible for you to avoid snobbery. It means that you have to put some thought into it, and it has to be objective thought. It has to be critical thought. And to put that into an illustration that maybe will make it a little clearer, when I mean an uncritical, categorical dismissal, I mean that if you were to say all men in the American South are wife beaters, you would be engaged in an act of snobbery, among other things. You would be engaged in an act of snobbery because you are uncritically dismissing an entire category. Whereas if you were to say all men who are wife beaters are scum, you would not be engaged in an act of snobbery because you have given it the nanosecond of critical attention that it deserves to come to that opinion. That is a justifiable opinion, critically, if you see what I mean. So if we're operating under that definition, and again, we'll try to keep this just restricted to books, although I think this definition and all the categories apply to everything. But if we're operating on that definition, then I think what we're talking about mainly is three kinds of snobbery. And the first one we can call personal, or maybe nostalgic. And this is when the person involved, and I'm going to try throughout this video not to say the man involved, because that would be sexist, although anyway, I'm going to try to say the person involved. In the case of personal or nostalgic snobbery, the person involved will have achieved some understanding of something at some early point in their development. High school, maybe, or the early years of college, maybe sparked by a really great class or a really charismatic teacher, having the exact opposite effect of what a charismatic teacher should have. In cases like that, the mind will just sort of ratchet on to that earliest interpretation, that earliest systematic way of looking at something, and admit no others, ever. You see this a lot in, for instance, music snobbery, where the music hipster, the stereotypical music snob will only like the very first things that ever imprinted upon them, and will then turn around and try to justify it. They'll try to make it critically respectable. It's not. It's never respectable to do that, and it's obvious too. It's not. You can tell right away when someone is trying to shore up an uncritical snobbery. by pulling in all sorts of critical words and concepts and whatnot. You can tell in a minute when someone's trying to do that. It's a thing that I always want to tell snobs, not just book snobs, but any kind of snob. A thing that I always want to tell them when I'm finished kicking their teeth in. But I'm old, so I don't do that anymore. The thing that I always want to tell them is the fact that you are a snob is extremely obvious, and I don't think they know it. I don't think that we're in a crowd of people or whatever, or on a panel discussion. I don't think they're aware that everyone around them knows that they're a snob, that it's not a critical appraisal of something, that it's just snobbery. And usually the most noticeable kind is this first kind, personal, nostalgic snobbery, where someone has just learned one aesthetic response to something, and that's it. That's all they're going to do. They're not ever going to change that because it must be right. And I think you can agree. I think we can all agree, no matter what our personal experiences with snobs are, I think we can all agree that that first kind of snobbery, personal, nostalgic snobbery, is the most boring kind. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. It's the least interesting. And that frees us to move on to the second kind of snobbery, which is far, far, far more common, and which is the type of snobbery that I think most people think of when they think of snobbery at all, and that is intellectual snobbery. And intellectual snobbery is when the snob in question tries to do the thing that I just mentioned, where they have an uncritical dismissal of a whole category. They are making an uncritical, categorical dismissal, but they want to dress it up. They want to dress it up as being critical, as being a really considered, detailed response to something. It isn't, and it only takes a moment's investigation to find that out. Like I said, it's obvious, and I don't think snobs know that. But intellectual snobbery at its heart comes from the snob in question fatally misunderstanding the whole idea of an objective assessment of an aesthetic experience. They fatally misunderstand that, and that is what undergirds their intellectual snobbery. I want to stress here that an objective assessment of an aesthetic experience, of an aesthetic product, of a work of art, an objective assessment of a work of art is, of course, possible. Okay, I want to start out the discussion by saying that. If you have ever fallen into a moment of weakness and said something along the lines of, well, you know, there's so much stuff out there, and to each his own, it's all subjective. If you have ever said it's all subjective, considering that I am a book critic, you are literally taking a swing at my profession. You're attempting to take eggs and bacon, maybe turkey, off my plate. No cause for alarm when Sir Charles thumps an arm. Sir Charles don't mean no harm. Bet the farm. It is, of course, possible to make an objective assessment of an aesthetic experience, of an aesthetic product. Of course it is. When you say, well, you know, there's so much writing out there, and, you know, who's to say, to each his own, it's all subjective. Follow that out. That if you're saying that, that means you are ultimately saying that all the things that you love on aesthetic grounds might be worthless. All of them. And that all things that anybody has loved on aesthetic grounds might be worthless. There might be no point to admiring an act of Shakespeare or the Mona Lisa or a fresco. But there might be no point to doing that because it's all subjective. So it might be bad. In fact, what people like these intellectual snobs are saying is that, or trying to say anyway, it's manifestly stupid. It's just manifestly wrong. What they're trying to say is there's no such thing as good and bad. And that kind of an attitude has led to a lot of crapola entering the public discourse free of criticism. The criticism it so richly deserves. No, it is, of course, possible to objectively analyze an aesthetic creation. The one-page, hastily scrawled paper that your grade school kid writes about what I did on my summer vacation, back when that wasn't simply I hid at home. The one-page paper that grade school student writes on what I did on my summer vacation is not as good as A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. And you know, an intellectual snob might say, well, of course it's not. I mean, don't be foolish. Don't make an obvious example. What I'm trying to say is, when you remove the ability to objectively assess an aesthetic creation, that is what you come to. It might sound extreme, but that is where you go. And it's obvious nonsense. And if your position can easily be reduced to obvious nonsense, your position is nonsensical. No, it is entirely possible to offer an objective assessment of an aesthetic creation. What intellectual snobs fail to realize is that there's no hierarchy of aesthetic creations. They think there is. They're willing to die on their belief that there is a hierarchy of aesthetic creations. That is not true. Take it from someone who was first socialized by a species that has no aesthetic creations. I am telling you, from an outside point of view, that is not true. There is no such thing as that hierarchy. That hierarchy does not exist. I know the intellectual snobs who might be listening to this are probably wailing in outrage right now, but nevertheless, it's true, and it's easily demonstrable as true. It is wrong. I won't say it's nonsense, because there are whole genres of literary criticism. There are whole schools of intellectual thought over the last 1,000 years that are built around this. So it obviously seems to have legs, but nevertheless, it is wrong to say that, if we stick to books, it is wrong to say that there is a hierarchy of aesthetic creation. It is wrong to say that, for instance, the writing of history is just across the board higher on the hierarchy than the writing of a Regency romance. That is wrong to say that, and that is the basis of intellectual snobbery, is that they are misunderstanding. They are thinking, they are misunderstanding the process of judging an aesthetic experience. And I understand why. I understand why they're doing it, because it's the same thing we all feel. You look, even if we just restrict ourselves to books, we're not talking about music or movies or anything like that, where it just gets worse. Even if we're just talking about books, there is an unending ocean, a gigantic, limitless Pacific Ocean of stuff out there. And you are a tiny little grain of sand. And you're here for hardly any time at all. And you can't devote all day long to reading. So past a certain point out of the nursery, you can sort of stand on the shore and look at that ocean and know you're never going to get to more than a tiny fraction of it. Just a tiny fraction. That bothers a lot of people. That's a disturbing thought. We would all like to get to all of it. Some people, a lot of intellectual snobs, all of them, I would say, take the horrible stab of insecurity that results from looking at that ocean that you're never going to sample. They take that insecurity and they need to fight it somehow. They need to fix it somehow. They need to make it right inside themselves, because it's a bad thing to feel. It feels bad to feel. And the way they take to make that insecurity feel better is to start dismissing huge parts of the ocean. to start saying, well, yeah, there's so much out there to read, but at least I can safely dismiss Westerns. Unless maybe my manservant, my valet, goes to the library and gets me the very one best Western. But other than that, I can dismiss the rest of them. I don't have to read them. I don't have to think about them. And I don't have to think about the people who like them, is the key here. I won't stress that too much. I'm trying not to make this too personal. But nevertheless, that's an attractive side benefit, is you don't have to think about the people who like them either. You can dismiss them too. It's kind of fun to categorically dismiss things. It gives you a little rush. We're going to see that later on in this little tedium fest. But for right now, the key that non-snobbish readers understand fairly early on, or in my case, late, they're a little bit slow to the party, but they figure it out eventually, or it gets shown to them eventually, is that reacting to that stab of insecurity that there's so much out there that you're never going to get to, with snobbery, is bad. That is a bad reaction. That is not worthy of you. It's not worthy of having one of the biggest and most complex conceptualizing brains in the history of the world. It's the proper response to that vast ocean is to feel the insecurity and just live with it. Yes, it's a bad feeling to know that there's so much out there you'll never get to. Yes, that is a bad feeling. But two bad feelings don't make a right. What you need to do is just live with that. Or, in the case of someone who has really dispensed with this kind of intellectual snobbery, to rejoice in it. Just make your peace with the fact that you're not going to get to it all, and that it's all a journey of discovery. That you can spark your enthusiasm can be sparked about anything. That is the correct response to that vast ocean, that you just being a tiny grain of sand looking at that ocean. But humans being neurotic creatures, by far the most common response is intellectual snobbery. which maintains as its fundamental belief that there is a hierarchy of aesthetic creations. So an intellectual snob will say, and they'll sometimes outright rank them. They'll say, well, I wish I had time to read the romances that you seem to like, or the science fiction, space aliens, pew pew laser battles. I wish I had time to read that, but I'm reading, whether it's scholarly history or long biographies, or the far most prevalent example, so-called literary fiction. They are the worst offenders. In our little corner of BookTube and everywhere else, they are the worst offenders because they honestly believe that they are dealing with the most worthy kind of aesthetic expression. And the only way you can think that is if you think there's a ladder. If you think there's a hierarchy that goes up and down, well, that's not the case at all. The only hierarchy, and this is where their misunderstanding comes in. This is where they misunderstand what is an actual valid thing. I started out by saying that I make my living off an actual valid hierarchy. But the only valid hierarchy is inside each genre. It doesn't cross. If it crossed genres, then there would be a ladder. But there isn't. It's inside each genre. Where you look at historical fiction, and you use a whole bunch of metrics that are objective, that you can talk about, that you can measure, that you can go into each chapter and even each sentence and point to say, in the genre of historical fiction, this is a much better job than this. That still doesn't touch on the aesthetic response at all. The aesthetic response is inviolable. It's wrong to take that fact and weirdly transmute it into saying, okay, what I like what I like. And I get to like what I like. And there's nothing wrong with me liking what I like. Plenty of people feel that, but some people feel that and then extrapolate that where extrapolation dare not go. They say, not only do I like what I like, and not only is that okay, but everything's the same. It's all subjective. It's not. It's not. It doesn't touch on your reaction. Your reactions are your own and inviolate. They are absolutely sacrosanct, and they're wonderful. I'm sure I'm not the only reader who's learned a lot from hearing that. But as Barb and Isabella point out in their version of this topic, it takes a little bit of courage to say that, to just enthuse about something that you love, especially if you know, and an online community like BookTube is going to make it easy for you to know, that maybe the thing you're enthusing about is widely regarded on that hierarchy that does not exist as being way down here. If you know that and you're prone to, a little bit of insecurity, then maybe you're going to hesitate to express your enthusiasm about that thing. Because you know that when you do that, the intellectual snobs who believe in a hierarchy of aesthetic creations will look down on you right away. They'll dismiss you right away. They'll make a category dismissal of you right away. It won't be a critical dismissal. It will still be invalid, but it stings. It absolutely stings. I had a conversation on this channel just the other day with Sarah from Bookish Knitter. About romance novels, which are stereotypically and accurately seen as the genre of books that are the most regularly condescended to, the most regularly categorically dismissed. They are the most popular object of snobbery, especially intellectual snobbery. And she was talking in that video about how even in the romance genre, there are levels of snobbery. There are people who think that category romances, like Harlequin romances, are automatically just across the board inferior to even other kinds of romances. I hope that and Sarah, I don't think, is any more prone to insecurity of the type that Barb and Isabella were talking about than I am, but I hope that you can see when you look at that kind of dismissal comes from insecurity. We'll get to that. We'll get to what you should do with a book snob. The point that I want to make about intellectual snobbery is that the basic thing that it's built on is false. And it's a misunderstanding. I'm not going to say that it's willful, evil or anything. I think it's a misunderstanding. They're thinking that because it's possible to make an objective assessment of the worth of things inside the same genre, which is certainly true, right? You're going to find Bill O'Reilly's ghostwritten Killing Custer, Killing Patton books in the same history section of your bookstore as you're going to find Sir Ronald Sim. They are writing in technically the same kind of genre, and there's no question at all who's doing a better job. None whatsoever. Intellectual snobs look at that fact that they are distantly aware of, although most of them, by the time they reach their mid-30s at the latest, don't read anything except what so-called literary fiction. They have codified themselves into that little playground. They don't extend beyond it, but they are aware of the fact that some things are considered better examples of certain kinds of genre than other things. They may tell their valet to go and get them a copy of, what's it called again? Sand? Oh no, Dune. I hear the little science fiction people think that's their best book. Would you please get me a copy of that, and preferably one without a garish cover? If they don't do that, they at least know about it. They know that there are grades within a genre, and they mistakenly, again, I'm going to say mistakenly rather than malevolently, they mistakenly extrapolate that too far into thinking that there are gradations within the whole spectrum of genres, and that's not true. That's absolutely not true. They're sometimes willing to make allowances for that when you get them into an area where they're looking for cool points. So they're sometimes willing to say, that poetry is often the way that where you will get them to contradict themselves. But I'm not trying to lay traps for people here. I'm merely, the main point that I want to make about personal snobbery is just that it's really boring, and there's almost never a way to get them out of that. So it's best just to talk about it briefly and drop it. And the main point that I want to make about intellectual snobbery is that it is based on a misapprehension. It's based on a mistake. It's people misunderstanding the whole phenomenon of making an objective assessment of an aesthetic creation. Critics do that. The good critics do. The bad ones think there is a hierarchy and say, oh, well, if you're going to read this novel, you might as well read a Louis L'Amour shoot-'em-up. As though all Louis L'Amour shoot-'em-ups, and by extension all Westerns, are just disposable trash. They almost always do this out of ignorance. They almost always haven't actually examined the thing they're dismissing via category. But the good critics don't do that. The good critics make it clear that what they're talking about is, if I'm assessing a biography of Amelia Earhart, well, the first thing I'm going to do is compare it to all the other biographies of Amelia Earhart, and then I'm going to compare it to all other biographies. I am not going to compare it to Robert Heinlein. I'm not going to compare it to things that don't warrant comparison, unless I'm a bad critic. But I'm going to say that it's mostly a misapprehension. And I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page. I want to make sure that I make myself clear anyway, that hierarchy of intellectual creations is false. It doesn't exist. That is the trap that intellectual snobs tend to fall into. It gives them comfort. I think it comes from insecurity. I think they look at that vast ocean that they know they're only going to make a little sliver in it for a few years, and then they die. And they have that stab of insecurity. It makes them feel terrible, and that is their response, is to say, well, yes, I'm only going to make a tiny essay into that ocean, but most of it isn't worth exploring anyway. I think we can agree that's probably an insecure response. Okay, a lot of snobbery is. So that is the second kind. And then we get to the third kind of snobbery, by far the worst kind, that existed for a long time in human history. And then with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and the Scientific Revolution, I think a lot of people kind of thought it was gone. But it is back, and it is moral snobbery. And it's the worst kind. The reason I say it's the worst kind is because unlike the other two kinds of snobbery, moral snobbery wants you dead. It isn't just talking about restricting what you read or watch or listen to. It wants you dead if you don't comply. And some of you are going to say, oh, that's just hyperbole, or my God, you're just exaggerating for effect, or whatever. There's a very wise German writer who said over a century ago, the people who start by burning books inevitably end up burning people. Moral snobbery is when the moral snobs in question, in the 21st century this has returned, when the moral snobs in question say, I'm categorically dismissing this thing, not because I haven't examined it and I have all these catchphrases that I learned in high school or whatever, but because it's evil. Because I've judged that it's evil because it doesn't conform to the right attitudes on subject A, subject B, subject C. And by sheer coincidence, I happen to have the right attitudes on all of those subjects and every other subject you could think of. So really what I'm saying is it doesn't conform with me. I myself don't like it. But I'm not going to say that. Instead, I'm going to say it's wrong. That it's on the wrong side of history. That it's wrong think. That it's evil. And the people who who are moral snobs don't just want to dismiss, right? The first two kinds, we're talking about people who are mainly reflecting their own inner insecurities at the vastness that they're never going to touch by dismissing large parts of it to make themselves feel like they're at least spending their time wisely. The third kind of snobbery doesn't just want to do that. And they don't just want to dismiss the intellectual creations. They also want to dismiss the people who like them. And by dismiss, right now, I mean cancel, unperson, mob on social media, get banned from curricula, get pulled down in statues in parks, get pulled from speaking engagements, get deplatformed, that sort of thing. Right now, that's what I'm talking about. The important thing to understand about moral snobs is that that isn't what they want. That isn't all of what they want. Because the number one aspect of their worldview that is different from intellectual snobs and personal snobs and from normal people, the number one aspect of their worldview that's different is that they do not believe in redemption. So they're fundamentally non-literary creatures to start with. It's a wonder they can even read. But they don't believe in anything like a redemption arc. They don't believe in re-education. They don't believe in changing your mind. As far as they're concerned, they have the perfect right think on every subject, including all literature. And if you don't, you're never gonna. And if you're always going to think wrong, and if thinking wrong is harmful, right now they settle for deplatforming and muzzling and getting publishing contracts voided and whatnot. But that isn't what they want. Since they don't believe you can ever be saved, what they want is for you to be dead. You're perfectly free in this video to say, Steve's just exaggerating, I don't know anybody like this, maybe you don't have any experience with them, but I'm right. I've seen this pattern before, and that is what they want. They want the people who don't agree with them dead. And that makes for them by far the worst kind of snobbery. By far the worst kind. In addition to which, they are also the stupidest people. Even the people who are guilty of personal snobbery, who have learned a little and then thought that's enough, at least have learned a little. Moral snobs typically don't know anything. They are typically the dumbest people you'll ever meet. They especially don't know anything about their subject at all. Not in the slightest. The subject that they're trying to get rid of, they usually don't know anything about it. Instead, they have a few canting catchphrases. Yikes. Read the room. Not a good fit. We all know those catchphrases. You have to spend 10 seconds on Twitter to see the whole barrage of them. And that's where these people live. They live on the broad range of social media, which is where they're able to have power. And they wouldn't have any power if upstanding, normal, bill-paying adults hadn't ceded it to them. And by bill-paying adults, I also mean bill-paying adults in the aggregate. Massive multi-million-dollar corporations have capitulated to this kind of censorious mob, and that fuels their power. If you are putting out, if your bottom line is $37 million, and a few blue check marks on Twitter say that you're a racist, if you capitulate completely to that, when it has no basis whatsoever, when it's not founded on anything, then that mob is only stronger. You have only made them stronger, and they only get stronger towards one end. They don't want a multiplicity of voices. Even intellectual snobs, they will think, because they think there's that hierarchy and some kinds of writing are just better than other kinds of writing. Absolute nonsense. Because they think that, they're able to dismiss the fans of all of the kinds of writing that are lower on the hierarchy, and literary fiction comes right up near the top because it happens to be what they like. Funny that way, how that works. They will dismiss those readers, but they know some of those readers. They don't want those readers dead. And moral censors do. Moral snobs want everyone who is the object of their snobbery dead. Ultimately, dead. They will take the consolation prizes that we have given them in the last 20 years. They will take censoring you, silencing you, deplatforming you, defunding you, taking away your livelihood, taking away the livelihood of your spouse and your children, making them pariahs, getting your social media contracts, your social media accounts canceled because you said something that disagrees with the right opinions, which just so happen to be all of their opinions. They'll take that. They'll take those little tactical victories, but it's not what they want. What they want is silence. They want themselves alone on a peak of righteousness, surrounded by silence. Nothing but that. Just them. That is the perfect world for them. And unfortunately, although, as I mentioned, these people tend to be exceedingly stupid, there are plenty of them in the book world. And you can spot them a mile off. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this tedium fest, you can spot these kinds of snobs a mile off. In the case of a moral snob, the way they give it away is the way they approach, let's say, books. We'll confine our discussion to books. The way they approach books is to do a deep dive, extensive research into the social media postings of the author. They will do a deep Google search, spend a whole afternoon, sometimes more than one afternoon, to find out the author's exact racial heritage, to find out whether or not the author has ever had any kind of sexual reassignment surgery or even thought about it. And especially to find out whether or not the author at any point in their past, anywhere in a public forum, or even a private forum, a private Facebook group, dig around, offer money, whether or not that author has ever said anything that varies from the right think that just so happens to be the way they think today. If the author has ever done that, well, then canceling that author might be appropriate. Sometimes is mandatory. And you'll notice in the description of their approach to those authors, I'm not mentioning any kind of approach to the work. That is absolutely true. The way you can tell a moral snob is because they will say, I have to extensively research an author before I know whether or not I want to read them. Not I have to sample their work. I have to extensively research them. I have to make sure they're not garbage, that they're not a garbage person, someone we should cancel. And make no mistake, I won't beat this anymore, but make no mistake, when these people say cancel, what they want to say is kill. And every time that moral snobs have ever been given the authority to kill, they have done it without hesitation. As far as they're concerned, they're on a mission from God. That makes them the worst kind of snobbery, the most dangerous kind, and even 40 years ago, I would have said they're a fringe group on the edge of the discussion. Now, they're driving the discussion in the publishing industry, and I didn't see that coming. I didn't see that as a side effect of social media, and I wish I didn't see it. But nevertheless, it's there, and those are the three main kinds of snobbery that I think we deal with. Let's confine it to the book world. And that naturally raises the question to finish up with of what to do about it. And in my own life, for a long time, far too long, what I did was knee-jerk aggression. They made me furious. And I confess, deep down inside, when I encounter just an unmitigated snob, it still makes me furious. The number one response that it provokes in me is anger. Because it is personally wounding. It's personally maddening to be just summarily dismissed. I hate that feeling. Anybody hates that feeling. But I think the best response when you encounter a snob like this, especially touching on the insecurity that Barb and Isabella were talking about, the best response when you encounter someone like this is pity. You should feel sorry for them. Even if they're sparking a kind of aggression inside you, you should get rid of that, because that's an unhealthy response. If I can do it, if I can get rid of it, you can get rid of it. The proper response to these people is pity. Because what are they doing? They're limiting the experience of what we all love. They're limiting their reading experience. Consciously doing it. No one's making them do it. They're consciously putting blinders and limits on how much enjoyment they get. Now think about your own reading experience when it's not snobbish. Think about all the discoveries you've made in places where, had you been one of those three kinds of snobs, you might have dismissed it entirely. You might not have even inquired. I can speak from personal experience. That's happened to me a million times. And the more I get rid of my uncritical, categorical dismissal of things, the more of those experiences I have. And snobs are never going to have that. They're just, whether it's, the thing they learned in high school, or whether it's literary fiction snobs who just, I'm scanning the catalogs of forthcoming books from publishers, and I'm seeing hundreds of thousands of titles, and I'm angrily dismissing all but a tiny handful of them. Is there somebody who's not cis-het? Is there somebody who's not a native-born American? I need to look at the literary fiction that they're doing. And I approve of it already. I love it already. I just want to know what it is. I think we can agree that's a really small, cramped reading experience. A person who is voluntarily making that their reading experience should be pitied. So the next time you encounter a literary snob, you don't have to come up with quick retorts. You don't have to come up with cutting rejoinders about how snobbery is evil. Of course it is. Snobbery is evil, but you don't have to come up with any of that, because all you have to do is remember that they are a pitiable figure. They are their own worst enemies. So you encounter someone like that who says, oh, you read the romance novels, huh? The bodice rippers. Your response, instead of saying, F you, should be, you dismiss them, do you? I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, I do. I love them. And the nicest thing, that has sometimes been very hard for readers to do. I believe that the difficulty of doing that has made a lot of snobs who just become snobs in order to fit into a crowd that's doing that to someone else, rather than have it done to them. The wonderful boon here in 2021, when it comes to that kind of situation, is that we've got your back, right? We have this little corner of BookTube where 200 channels read every kind of stuff under the sun, and you still watch them. Even if you're not really sure you would ever read the kind of book they're enthusing about, their enthusing goes a huge way. You can't dismiss that thing anymore. Next time you go to a bookstore and you see it, instead of thinking, puh, you're thinking, so-and-so, who I really like to spend time with every week, really likes that. And that changes everything. That changes everything. So now when you are in that situation, if we're ever allowed to congregate again, just think of BookTube. just to modify the old phrase, just close your eyes and think of BookTube. Just think of BookTube. Just think of us. We have your back. This is the ultimate cure for snobbery. As I know from personal experience, I watch a ton of BookTube, and I've had that reaction. Even after all this time hating snobs, I've had that reaction where someone will hold up a book and I'll think, okay, well, I read that, and I didn't like anything that author wrote. I don't like that kind of writing. And then the person will start to talk about it, and my mind will start to open. That is great. I'm sure that's happened to you, and maybe because of BookTube. So the shot in the arm cure for the kinds of snobbery that I'm talking about is to think of BookTube. The only addition I would make to that, I won't stress it too much, I've hit it many times in many videos, is that the one other thing that you should do is if you encounter moral snobbery, and that is to fight it. If you encounter a moral snob, you should fight it. You should attack it. You should attack that snobbery when you see it. You should resist it in all cases when you see it. You should still feel pity for the person who feels that way, but you should attack it, because the end goal of that snobbery is the end of your life. And that's important. That's very different than the other kinds of snobbery. So, but anyway, we'll get to that on some SJW video or something or other. Right now, all we're talking about is these 3 kinds of snobbery that I've been dealing with my whole 28 years. And I just thought I would give my thoughts on the subject in case they're of any interest. So I'm gonna wrap this up. It of course went long. You get somebody who's trained by the Jesuits to do categorical thinking, and it's gonna go long. You're lucky I didn't subdivide. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.